I sold this Echo trimmer years ago to a friend and it finally started having some issues, which is quite surprising. When I first gave it to them, I advised them to use pre-mixed fuel in the can, and that's exactly what they've been doing, so I have to wonder, why in the world would it start having issues using engineered fuel? In today's video, we look at this Echo trimmer, and the problem is that it has a hard time starting. Now, I'm a big fan of Echo equipment, and even though this one is a curved shaft, I'd still use it over a lot of other brands, even with more power, and the reason is pretty simple: it is extremely easy to use. Now, I'm going to try and repair this trimmer, however, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. I was looking back at my library of repair videos to see if I could find this one, and for some reason I couldn't find it. Now the reason is that I want to see how I repaired it, but I guess I'm never going to find out. There's unfortunately no fuel in the tank, so I won't be able to sample the fuel that was being used in it, which would have been very useful. The next thing I'm going to do is pull on the rope and feel if the engine still has compression, and fortunately I can feel the engine fighting back a fair amount. If I wanted a definite answer about how worn out it was, I'd use a compression tester. The next step is to put some fuel into the carb's throat and see if it'll start and run for a few seconds. Now the air filter is dirty, but more importantly, I think at some point fuel has soaked into it. If that's not enough foreshadowing for you, well, just keep watching the video. I'm using a chemical bottle to easily put mixed fuel into the carb. If you'd like one of these, there should be a link in the description. Luckily, it started and ran for a really long time. More than likely, there's still some fuel inside the carb. Just for fun, I'm going to put some mixed fuel into the tank and see if it might run on its own. You never know, it might start up and run just fine. Now, the first big test is whether the purge bulb is going to fill up with some fuel. If it doesn't, it's unlikely the engine is going to start. Fortunately, ours is filling up, which is a great sign that the carb is in working condition. So it started and ran for a while before it stopped, but that's pretty good considering this trimmer probably hasn't been used for some time. Well, that's kind of surprising that it started and ran just fine. I'm not sure what they were going on about, but I don't see any issues with this trimmer. So what am I going to do with it now? Well, there are a few things I can fix and replace. That way, when I give it back to him, it'll be ready for the mowing season. The only problem I'm having is, why did the air filter get soaked with fuel at some point? I hate to spoil it, but this trimmer is going to throw me a curveball later on in this video. Now, I must have worked on this trimmer a long time ago because it looks like I only replaced one of the lines, which was the return line. Unfortunately, it's begun to harden, and more than likely there's a fuel leak here at the lines. To test for a leak, I'm going to turn the trimmer on its side and see if it leaks from here. After a minute on its side, I was able to confirm that we do have a leak, and it only appears to be from the lines and not the grommet, which is kind of surprising because if the lines need changing, the grommet needs it too. However, there are no cracks and the grommet is still flexible. For those of you who don't know, this line that connects to the port on the carb that's closer to the air filter is for the return line. The fuel line that connects to the port closer to the engine is for the fuel filter, and the last line is for the fuel tank vent, which allows air to move into the tank as the fuel moves out of it. Now, you don't need to remove the carb to replace the fuel lines, but I'm going to because it'll make it easier to film. Otherwise, there is plenty of room to do this, unlike some other trimmers where you have to have special bluish-green fuel lines because of the lack of space. Next, I'll pull the lines out of the grommet, but for the filter line, I want to pull it back into the tank since the filter is still attached to it. Once the lines are free from the tank, don't forget to take off the tank vent and the filter before you throw them away. If you think these need to be replaced, this will be a good time to do it. The fuel line I'm going to be using is 3/16 of an inch, and if you need some for your project, there should be a link in the description. After cutting the end at an angle and pushing it into one of the openings, I'm going to pull it out through the fuel cap opening. And because this one is going to have a fuel filter installed on it, I have to cut the angle piece off. After installing the fuel filter, push it back into the tank, making sure there's enough line to let it reach the far end of the tank. Once I know I have plenty of fuel line in the tank, I'll then cut the line at about the area where the carb will be located at. After that, I need to repeat the process 2 more times. However, I don't need to install any more filters. Also, if you want to, you don't have to cut the angle piece off unless you really want to, so it's up to you. The only issue you're going to have is that once all the lines have been installed, you might get confused as to which line is which. Remember that you're going to have 2 lines that don't have a filter on them and 1 that will. The most important one to keep track of is, of course, the filter line. Now, leaving the fuel cap off will help you keep the lines straight. Next, pick one of the 2 lines with no filters to install the tank vent, and then put it where it belongs, which is an opening on the side of the recoil cover. Next, I'm going to install the filter line to the port closer to the engine, which only leaves the return line to connect to the port closer to the air filter. For a quick demonstration, I'm going to use a bolt to hold up the carb because I need to test the fuel flow through the lines. So when pressing the bulb, fuel should come up the filter line and into the carb. It should then try and fill the bulb before leaving the carb through the return line. So I had to edit out a lot of the bulb pressing, but it took some time before the fuel was even visible in the filter line. Also, it's not filling the bulb like it was before. The strange thing is that we didn't even touch the carb at all, and replacing the lines with new ones should not be causing these issues. Now, even though it's taken more time than before, the carb should have fuel in it, so we should be able to start it after putting the last few parts back on. Unfortunately, if I was paying attention, I would have realized that a flow issue through the lines typically means we have a carb issue and a bigger problem than I originally thought. I was having a hard time starting it unlike before, and while I was struggling with it, I noticed a fuel leak from the carb and air filter. That means I need to put it back on the table and look at the carb, which wasn't an issue in the first place. As you can see, there's a very good leak from the carb, and it's hard to say where it's coming from, but I believe the leak is internal. It's unfortunate that it didn't do this when we had the carb off earlier, but I guess it's better that it happens while I have it versus if I had given it back to my friend. Once we get the carb off the engine, I'm going to look at the metering diaphragm. Since it controls the fuel flow through the carb, there might be an intermittent issue causing it to work sometimes, but also causing it to leak other times, and that's why the air filter was somewhat wet and why the tank was empty. So here's the metering diaphragm, and even though it can still move and it's not petrified, it should be a lot more flexible than this. It should feel like a t-shirt, not a pressed dress shirt from the cleaners. That means we need to replace it. The only thing we need to make sure is that the replacement diaphragm has the same length stem as the old one. The stems can be either short or long, and this one needs to be the short one. When installing the diaphragm, remember that the gasket goes down first, followed by the diaphragm. If you want to avoid this sort of rebuild for the carb, there's nothing wrong with just buying a cheap aftermarket carb for less than $15. Now, once I get the carb back onto the engine, I want to see how well the purge bulb works after changing the diaphragm. If there's an improvement from the previous time, then I think we definitely fixed it, and it's going to perform a lot better. Just as soon as I started pressing the bulb, fuel from the tank started flowing through the lines and filling the bulb, which is a huge improvement. If you're having bulb issues, then you might want to consider replacing your carb. If you're still having issues, then there might be an issue with your fuel lines or the filter. So in the end, we had to replace the fuel lines and the metering diaphragm, but after that, it's running a whole lot better. Now the trimmer lines need to be changed out, but other than that, I'd say it's worth every penny we spend on it. Another reason why it was having running issues is a leak at one of the engine seals. If you think this might be an issue with your trimmer, you should see an oil leak coming from somewhere on the plastics on the engine. The fix is of course to replace the seal, which is much harder than it sounds. So my question is, do you think premixed fuel in a can caused the fuel lines and metering diaphragm to go bad? Personally, I don't think we'll ever know, but I'm still going to recommend it as a fuel source, especially if you only need a few cans a year. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.